The little bed frame came out the front door first, tipped sideways in a worker's arms, and Tessa Reed lunged to catch the mattress sliding off it before it hit the wet concrete. Rain was coming down hard, straight and gray, soaking the planet sheets through in seconds. "Please just wait," she said, dragging a blue tarp off the pile of belongings and throwing it over the bed. "I have the receipts. I paid. This is a mistake." A worker set a second mattress against the railing, and the plastic cover split in the wind. June, 7 years old in a yellow raincoat too small for her, looked up at her mother. "Are we going somewhere?" Tessa smoothed her hood. "Just for one night, baby." Across the street, a man had stopped under an awning, staring at the notice taped beside the door. "Welcome to Hearthlight Stories, where we tell the kind of stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. If this one reaches you even a little, please take a second to tap the like button. It genuinely helps these stories find the people who need them. And I always love knowing how far they travel. So drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from today, your city, your state, your country. If you enjoy emotional stories about ordinary people, quiet strength, and second chances, consider subscribing so you don't miss what's coming. Now let's go back to that flooded sidewalk on Linden Court, and to the man under the awning who has just stopped breathing. The building was 742 Linden Court, a 4-story brick walk-up with a rusted black railing and unit numbers peeling off the doors, the kind of building that had held working families for 40 years, without anyone in a glass office ever thinking about it. Tessa had lived in Unit 3B for 3 years. It was not a beautiful apartment, but she had made it a home. She'd painted June's room a pale green, had helped Eli tape his hand-cut star stickers onto his bed frame in the shape of real constellations, had learned which radiator knocked and which window stuck. Now the contents of that home were coming down the front steps in the rain, one armload at a time. The eviction crew was not cruel. That was almost the worst part. They were 3 men in rain jackets doing a job they'd been dispatched to do, working off a clipboard and a schedule, and one of them had actually said, "Sorry, ma'am," when he set the kitchen chairs down in a puddle. They weren't villains. They were just people who had been handed a piece of paper with a legal seal on it and told to empty a unit. And none of them had the authority, or by now, the interest, to relitigate whether the paper was right. Tessa did have the interest. She had a gallon-size freezer bag, doubled over, that held every document she owned about this apartment. Money order stubs, a rental assistance approval letter, printed emails, a screenshot of the tenant portal. She'd been holding it against her chest for 20 minutes, offering it to anyone who'd look. "The balance they're claiming isn't real," she told the crew foreman, keeping her voice level because she knew, the way women like her always know, that the moment she raised it, she'd become the angry tenant and stop being believed. "I have an approved assistance payment. I have an active appeal. The removal was supposed to be on hold." "You'll have to take that up with the management company," the foreman said, not unkindly. "We just got the possession order this morning." This morning. Tessa's stomach turned over. She'd filed the appeal 11 days ago. She'd gotten a confirmation number. She'd been told, in writing, that removal would pause pending review. And they'd sent a crew this morning, anyway. Eli was 11, and he was trying very hard to be older than that. He had gone quiet the way he went quiet, and he was moving through the growing pile of belongings on the sidewalk with a terrible focus, pulling out the things that mattered: his astronomy notebook, wet at the corner, a shoebox of small treasures, and stacking them under the overhang where they'd stay dry. Then June made a sound, a real cry, the first one, and Tessa turned and saw it. Pepper, June's gray rabbit, the one she slept with every single night, had fallen from the top of a box and was lying face down in the flooded gutter, the current pushing it toward the storm drain. Before Tessa could move, Eli did. He splashed off the curb into ankle-deep water, grabbed the rabbit, and came back, soaked to the knees, and handed it to his sister without a word. June clutched it to her chest, and it dripped, and she started to cry harder. And Tessa knelt down in the rain right there on the sidewalk and held both of them, the freezer bag of proof pressed between them, and she did not cry, because if she cried, they would fall apart. And someone had to not fall apart. That was the moment the man under the awning crossed the street. He had been standing there for 2 full minutes, and he had not moved, because he could not. His name was Adrian Vale, and he had been 3 blocks away at another one of his properties for a routine site visit, and his driver had taken this street because the main road was flooded, and Adrian had asked him to slow down because he'd seen furniture on a sidewalk in the rain, and something about it had reached into him before his mind caught up. Then he'd gotten out, told the driver to circle, and walked to the awning, and read the notice taped beside the door of 742 Linden Court. Across the top of it was a logo he knew better than his own signature: Vale Community Residential, his company. And down in the body of the notice, in the standard legal language of the possession order, was a phrase in bold type: possession restored to owner. And Adrian Vale, 48 years old, worth more money than the entire block of Linden Court would sell for, stood in the rain reading 4 words he had first read at the age of 10 on a door in a storm, while his mother covered their couch with a shower curtain and told him and his little brother that they were only going to be away for 1 night. His hand went into his coat pocket, on its own, and closed around the small brass key he had carried there for 30 years. Adrian Vale was, by any measure, a self-made man, and he had spent his whole adult life trying to make sure a particular thing never happened again, and he had just watched it happen with his name on the paper. It is enough to say about his money that he had a great deal of it, that Vale Community Residential owned or managed tens of thousands of housing units across a dozen states, that his face turned up in the business press under headlines about doing well by doing good, that he could have bought 742 Linden Court outright without checking the balance in any account. The money is not the point of Adrian. The money was the answer he had built to a question that had been put to him when he was 10 years old, and the tragedy of his life, though he didn't know it yet, was that he had built the wrong answer. He'd grown up in unstable housing, not romantically unstable, not a colorful hard luck story, but the real thing, the endless churn of it, the 4 apartments in 6 years, the boxes that never fully got unpacked because his mother had learned that unpacking was tempting fate. His father had left when Adrian was 8, and his mother, Rosa Vale, had raised him and his younger brother Marcus alone, cleaning hotel rooms on weekdays and working a school cafeteria line on weekends, and still the arithmetic never worked, because for people like Rosa, the arithmetic is not designed to work. The night that made Adrian who he was happened when he was 10. He remembered it in pieces, the way you remember the things that are too big to hold all at once. He remembered the notice on the door when they came home. He'd read it out loud because his mother's reading was slow, and his was quick, and he'd read the words, "possession restored to owner," without understanding them, and he'd watched his mother's face understand them for him. He remembered that it was raining. He remembered Rosa moving fast and calm at the same time, draping a plastic shower curtain over the good couch, telling him to find Marcus's shoes, both of them. The shoes were important. He remembered carrying his brother's shoes pressed against his chest under his jacket so they'd stay dry. And he remembered thinking, with a child's strange logic, that if he kept the shoes dry, then everything would be all right. He remembered a mattress on the sidewalk, dark and swelling with rain, and he remembered understanding for the first time that a bed, the place you were supposed to be safest, could become garbage on a curb in the space of an afternoon. And he remembered his mother's voice, low and steady, telling Marcus, who was 6 and frightened, that they were going on a little adventure, that they'd be somewhere else, just for one night. They spent that night, and several after it, in the basement of a church that took families in. Rosa slept, sitting up in a folding chair with an arm around each boy. She never once let them see her afraid. It was years before Adrian understood that just for one night had been a lie she told to keep them from breaking, and that she had not, on that night, had any idea where they would sleep the night after. Rosa eventually clawed her way back to something stable, a small 2-bedroom apartment across town, a landlord who was decent, a lease she kept for the rest of her life. On the day she got the keys, she'd given one to Adrian to keep, a heavy brass key on a loop of twine, and told him, half joking, that he was the man of the house now and had to guard the door. He had kept that key for 30 years. It was in his pocket, right now. Rosa died when Adrian was 39, of the accumulated wear of a hard life, in that same small apartment, before Vale Community Residential became what it became. At her funeral, Adrian had made himself a promise silently, the only way he made promises. He was already wealthy by then, from a construction business he'd built and sold, and he'd decided he would put every dollar of it into housing, not the luxury kind, the ordinary kind, the kind Rosa never had until it was almost too late. And he would run it so that no child in one of his buildings would ever carry his brother's shoes under his jacket, in the rain. He would build the thing that should have existed for his mother. And for a while he did exactly that, and it worked. And he was proud of it, and the pride was earned. But companies grow, and growth has a logic of its own. To build more housing, he needed more capital. And capital came with expectations, and expectations became metrics, and metrics became dashboards. And somewhere in the great scaling up of his good intentions, Adrian stopped seeing buildings and started seeing portfolios. He acquired other companies' properties by the hundreds. He outsourced the day-to-day management of many of them to third-party firms, because that was efficient, because he could not personally manage 30,000 units. He approved software systems that automated collections and turnover, because automation was cheaper than staff. He read reports that celebrated falling delinquency and faster turnaround, and he approved them. And he felt good, because the numbers were the numbers he wanted. He had not stood on a sidewalk outside one of his own buildings in a very long time. He had not read one of his own eviction notices in years. He had built the whole enormous machine to honor a promise to his mother, and then he had climbed so high above the machine that he could no longer see the one thing it had been built to prevent, which was a child's bed, in the rain, on a curb, with his company's name on the paper. He crossed the street. his good shoes filled with water. He didn't notice. Tessa Reed had done everything right, which was the thing that would eventually make Adrian angriest, because a system that punishes carelessness is merely unjust, but a system that punishes diligence is something worse. She was 34. She worked overnight, from 10 at night to 6 in the morning, as an inventory clerk at a regional medical supply warehouse, counting and scanning and reconciling in the fluorescent quiet while her city slept. A job she'd taken because the night differential paid a little more, and because it let her be home in the mornings to get Eli and June to school. She was good with numbers and better with records. 2 years ago, she'd been most of the way through a certificate in bookkeeping and property administration at the community college, and she'd loved it, loved the clean logic of a ledger that balanced, and she'd had to stop 3 courses short when the child care center changed its hours and her supervisor changed her schedule, and the whole fragile structure of her life shifted an inch and brought the ceiling down. She'd kept her textbooks. People like Tessa always keep the textbooks. She had learned some things about apartments from her grandfather, who had managed a few rental units and had taught her, when she was young, how to reset a breaker and bleed a radiator and read a lease. So when 742 Linden Court had problems, and it had them, a leaking valve, a back door that wouldn't seal, a stretch in February when the heat in the building ran unreliable, she documented them, formally, in emails, because her grandfather had taught her that in housing, the person with the paperwork wins. The trouble had started in the spring when her hours got cut. The warehouse lost a contract, and everyone's shifts shrank, and Tessa, who ran a household on a razor's margin, did the responsible thing. She applied for rental assistance through a county program, was approved, and notified her landlord. And that would have been the end of it, except that right in the middle of it, her building was acquired by Vale Community Residential, and everything about the way she paid rent changed overnight. There was a new tenant portal. There was a migration of all the old account records into a new system. And in that migration, something went wrong with Tessa's account, the way things go wrong in migrations, quietly and invisibly. A decimal here, a misapplied credit there. Her assistance payment, the county sent it directly, posted to the building's master account, but never made it onto her individual resident ledger. A money order she'd paid in person got applied to a different unit entirely, 3D instead of 3B, one letter. The maintenance credits she'd been promised for the February heat problem vanished in the transfer. And on top of all of it, the automated system, seeing what it thought was an unpaid balance, began stacking late fees, one after another, each one generating on a schedule, none of them touched by a human hand. By summer, the portal said Tessa owed money she had, in provable fact, already paid. She could see it. She could prove it. And she could not make anyone fix it. She called. She held. She was transferred between the outsourced management company and something called resident accounts, and something else called the assistance desk, each of which told her the other one handled it. She went in person to the management office, which kept hours, 9 to 5, weekdays, that were precisely the hours a woman who worked overnight and slept during the day and cared for 2 children could least manage. And she made it there anyway, twice, taking a bus across town on no sleep. She submitted her documents. She got confirmation numbers. She filed a formal appeal when the first notice came, and she received, in writing, an acknowledgement that removal would be paused, pending review. She built the freezer bag of proof, doubled over against the weather. because some animal part of her had known it might come to standing on a sidewalk, in the rain, needing to prove her own life. Through all of it, she protected the children, which is its own full-time labor. She kept the routines. She made the same cheap good meals. When Eli, who missed nothing, saw the school astronomy club's overnight trip form on the refrigerator, $40, a bus to a dark sky park, the thing he wanted more than anything, and quietly took it down and put it in the recycling, without a word, Tessa saw him do it, and she fished it back out that night, after he was asleep. And she did not know yet how she'd find the $40, but she folded the form and put it in her bag, because some sacrifices a mother refuses to accept from her child. June was easier to protect, being 7 and still living mostly in the warm, imaginative country of childhood. But June had her own antennae. When June's bed frame lost a caster and tilted, Tessa fixed it with a wooden block and screws from her grandfather's old toolbox, rather than telling June it was broken, so that June never knew her bed had a flaw. June slept with Pepper every night, the gray rabbit worn soft and thin, and named her drawings and her worries alike, and asked the kind of questions that come straight up out of a child, with no filter in between. Mom, why do we have so many boxes we never open? Questions that landed like small, precise blows. They had been happy in that apartment. That was the truth that the sidewalk erased for anyone watching. They had been a family with a home, a green room, and a bedroom full of stars, and they had been getting by, barely, the way most families get by. And then a computer decided they owed money they didn't owe, and a schedule sent a crew. And now the beds were in the rain. Which was where Adrian Vale, soaked to the shins, walked up to the foreman and said, "Stop, stop the removal, now." The foreman looked at him with the patient irritation of a man who has heard a lot of people say stop. "Sir, I can't stop a possession order because somebody on the street asks me to. Only the management company or the court." "I'm Adrian Vale," Adrian said. "This is my company." He nodded at the notice on the door. The logo. Vale Community Residential. "Call your dispatcher. Tell them the chairman is on site and is ordering the removal paused, and that I'll take personal responsibility for the instruction in writing within the hour." There was a particular silence then. The foreman looked at the notice, and at the man, and at the very expensive, very quiet car now idling at the corner, and something in his posture changed. He stepped away and made a call. Tessa stood up slowly, June on her hip, Eli pressed against her side, and she looked at this man who had arrived out of the rain to announce that he owned the machine that was destroying her, and she did not feel grateful. She felt something closer to fury, cold and clear. "You own it," she said. "I do. Your company," she said it flatly. "Your notice, your crew." She looked at the beds, the tarp, the split plastic, Pepper dripping in June's arms. "You showed up after the beds got wet." It hit him. It was meant to. "Yes," Adrian said. There was nothing else honest to say. His instinct, the instinct of 30 years of solving things with resources, came roaring up, and he let some of it out before he could stop himself. "Let me get you out of the rain. I'll put you in a hotel tonight, the good one downtown, and I'll replace everything that's damaged, all of it, today, and we'll get this sorted." "No." Tessa's voice cut clean through the rain. "No hotel that I'll owe you for, no cash, no replacing my son's bed like it's nothing." She shifted June higher on her hip. "You want to help? Then hear me. The problem didn't start when you walked up. It started months ago, when your system decided I owed money I'd already paid, and nobody, not one single person in your whole company, would read the papers I kept bringing them. My kids are not your before and after picture. You don't get to fix me on a sidewalk in front of the neighbors so you can feel like a good man. She held up the freezer bag. I want this read, properly, by someone who has the authority to correct it. That's what I want, not a favor. Adrian Vale had been told a great many things by a great many people over the years, most of them flattering. He had not, in longer than he could remember, been told the truth this cleanly, and it went into him like the cold rain going through his coat. "All right," he said, and then, more slowly, correcting his own instinct in real time, "Not a favor. You're right." He turned to the foreman, who was off the phone now. "The removal is paused. Confirmed?" A nod. "Good. I want the family's belongings moved into a dry, secured company storage unit tonight. Inventoried, documented, a copy of the inventory to Ms." He glanced at her. "Reed," Tessa said. "Tessa Reed. 3B, not 3D. That's part of the problem." "To Ms. Reed. And I want emergency lodging arranged through our resident displacement policy. The official one. On the record, the way it should run for anyone." He looked at Tessa. "There's a policy. Whether it's ever actually offered to people is a separate question I'm apparently going to have to answer. But it exists, and you qualify. And it's not a favor. It's a right. Will you take it?" Tessa studied him. A gift she would refuse until the sky fell. But a documented process, run correctly, the kind of thing that would exist for the next family too. That was different. "I want everything in writing," she said, "and I keep my originals. You get copies." "Understood." She gave him copies that evening at the edge of the storage lot, standing under the tailgate of the truck while the crew inventoried her life into a dry unit. Copies of the money order stubs, the assistance letter, the portal screenshots, selected and deliberate, keeping the originals in the freezer bag against her chest. And as Adrian looked through them under the truck's dome light, he saw it, the thing that would keep him up that night. The portal showed 2 different balances for the same month, on 2 different screenshots taken 3 days apart, with no payment in between to explain the change. "These don't match," he said. "No," said Tessa, "they don't. And when I asked why, 3 different people gave me 3 different answers, and none of them were the same as the paper." She took the copies back. No, the copies she let him keep, took only the originals, and looked at him steadily. "You want to know what's really wrong with your company, Mr. Vale? It's not that somebody's evil. It's that your own computer can't agree with itself about what I owe, and nobody whose job it is to care gets paid to notice." Adrian did not sleep that night. He went back to headquarters instead, to the clean glass building with the maps and the dashboards and the framed photographs of smiling families, and he laid Tessa Reed's documents out on the long table in his office and read them the way he had not read anything about his own company in years, which is to say slowly, and looking for the truth rather than the summary. By morning he had questions, and he had called in Marisol Grant, his regional director of resident operations, a woman who had been with the company 11 years and knew where things were kept. Marisol was not defensive at first. She was thorough, which was worse. She pulled up 3B's account and walked him through what the system said. And the system said Tessa Reed was 4 months delinquent, that a notice had issued when her balance crossed an automated threshold, that a possession order had followed the standard timeline, that a vendor, the outsourced management firm, had handled the filing and dispatched the crew. By the numbers, Marisol said. The process was followed. Then explain this, Adrian said, and put the two conflicting screenshots in front of her. Explain why the same account shows two balances in the same week. Explain why her assistance payment isn't on her ledger when the county has a confirmation that it was sent to us. Explain why there's a money order posted to 3D, an empty unit, in the exact amount she says she paid. Explain why her appeal, here's the confirmation number, was acknowledged with a removal hold, and a crew showed up 11 days later anyway. Marisol was quiet for a moment, reading. Then she said, carefully, the appeal was submitted through the resident portal. The removal instruction went to the vendor through a different system. They don't always sync. She looked up, and Adrian saw the exhaustion of a professional who has raised a concern and been overruled. I flagged this 18 months ago, when we onboarded the vendor and migrated the acquisition accounts. I said the appeal hold and the eviction pipeline needed to talk to each other, and I was told it was a Phase 2 integration, and Phase 2 kept getting pushed because it wasn't revenue generating. She let that sit. So no, nobody targeted Ms. Reed. And also, yes, we did this to her. Both things are true. That's the part nobody wants in a report. Adrian asked the question that would become the axis of everything that followed. If nobody meant to hurt her, why did the hurting keep going after she proved, over and over, that she was right? Marisol didn't answer right away, because they both already knew. Because no single person's job was to stop it. Because the payment lived in one system and the fees in another, and the appeal in a third. And each system did exactly what it was designed to do. And the family fell through the seams between them. And the seams were where Adrian had never looked. He recognized the phrase on the notice, too. He asked Marisol where the wording came from. Possession restored to owner. And she told him it was boilerplate, a standard legal template used across the industry for decades. The same language his mother had read on a door in the rain. And Adrian understood, sitting in his glass office, that the reason the words had reached back 30 years and grabbed him was not some mystical coincidence. It was that housing had changed far less than he'd told himself it had. He'd built thousands of new units and a national brand and a reputation for doing good. And underneath all of it, the same 4 words still went up on the same kind of door, and still put the same kind of child's bed on the same kind of curb. He began an investigation. He did it lawfully. He did not touch Tessa's private records without the copies she'd chosen to give him. He did not surveil her. He worked from what a company is entitled to examine about itself. De-identified eviction data, the ledger migration logs, the vendor contracts, the appeal timestamps, the maintenance credit records, the workload numbers, the resident complaints, the board reports he had personally approved. And piece by piece, over the following weeks, the machine revealed itself to him, not as a conspiracy, but as something harder to fight. A system doing precisely what it had been built and paid to do. The ledger migration had misapplied payments and stripped credits across not just Tessa's account, but hundreds of accounts in the recently acquired properties. Her case was not rare, it was a category. The appeal portal and the eviction vendor ran on systems that did not communicate, so a hold could be granted, and an eviction could proceed at the same time, and neither hand knew what the other was doing. The vendor's contract paid bonuses for faster delinquency reduction, faster turnover, lower staff time per case, and higher collections. Every incentive pointed toward moving families out quickly and none pointed toward getting the balance right. Human review had been engineered out of the process as an inefficiency, a notice generated automatically, once a balance crossed a threshold, and no trained employee was required to check whether there was a pending assistance payment, a recent payment, an open maintenance dispute, an active appeal, or children in the home before that notice became a crew on a sidewalk. The company had hardship programs and mediation options. Adrian had funded them, had cited them in interviews, but residents were rarely told they existed. The information was buried and written in language nobody could parse. The offices closed before working tenants could reach them, and property managers earned nothing for preventing an eviction. So preventing evictions was nobody's incentive and everybody's afterthought. And above all of it sat the dashboards, the beautiful green dashboards Adrian had praised in board meetings, showing falling delinquency and faster turnaround and fewer open complaints. And he understood now, with a nausea that did not pass, that some of those resolved complaints had simply become evictions, that the numbers he'd celebrated as success had counted Tessa Reed's family as a problem solved. He had not ordered anyone's children's beds into the rain. He'd never signed a page with Tessa Reed's name on it. But he had built and funded and praised a system in which every individual could follow every rule, and the sum of all that rule following was a 7-year-old's rabbit floating toward a storm drain. Absence at scale does the work of cruelty and lets everyone keep their conscience. That was the thing he had built. That was the wrong answer to his mother's question. If this story is settling somewhere real for you, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe. It helps more than you'd think, and there are more of these coming. And I want to ask you something. Have you ever known a parent who could make losing everything sound like a small thing, just for one night, just until things settle? Because what comes next is where a good intention runs straight into the wall it was built to knock down. He did not fix Tessa's case. He built a way for her to fix things, hers and everyone's, and she made him earn the right to offer it. They called it the Resident Stability Fellowship, and Adrian built it, at Marisol's blunt insistence, to survive him: independent oversight board, a legal aid attorney, community members, a resident representative with real authority, paid training, support to finish bookkeeping and property administration certification, fair housing and resident account coursework, predictable hours, childcare assistance, because Adrian had finally understood, at 48, that childcare was not a benefit, but the hinge everything swung on. Legal help to correct wrongful records, not just Tessa's, all of them. Supervised work experience and a real hiring pathway at the end. And selection kept entirely independent of Adrian, which was how Tessa demanded it and how the board required it. She did not walk in the door. She earned it. There was a records review exercise, a ledger reconciliation test, a resident conversation scenario with an actor, an interview, a property operations assessment. Adrian was walled off from the scoring completely. Tessa scored at the top of the reconciliation test. She found in the sample ledger they gave her 2 errors the test wasn't even designed to include. Planted mistakes the assessors hadn't planted, real ones that had drifted into the practice file, and she flagged them, and the assessors had to go check their own work. In the conversation scenario, the actor playing a frightened tenant told the panel afterward that he'd forgotten it was a test. She agreed to join only after she'd read the terms twice and added her own, in writing. No use of her family's story, ever, without her explicit written consent each time. Independent selection. Wages and hours in writing, child care support, a path open to others, not just her, real authority to flag errors, protection against retaliation. And she would owe Adrian Vale nothing, personally, ever. He signed all of it. Letting someone with less power set the terms did not feel like losing. It felt like the first correct thing he'd done in years. The months that followed were hard and good. Tessa studied after her overnight shifts at the little table in the motel where the family was staying through the displacement policy, a clean, impersonal place with 2 beds and a vending machine that hummed all night, a place she refused to call home. She learned the property management software better than people who'd used it for years. Eli taped a few of his star stickers to the wall above his motel bed, provisionally, and drew constellations in his notebook. And June asked, every few days, when Pepper could have a real shelf again. And Tessa kept saying soon, and this time she was starting to believe it. She was not instantly perfect. She failed the Fair Housing Compliance module the first time, badly, and took it hard, harder than it deserved. And Marisol, who had become something like a mentor and something like a friend, told her, "You think you have to be flawless to be allowed in the room. You don't. You just have to keep coming back to the room." Tessa took the module again and passed. She argued with a supervisor once about a procedure and turned out to be right, and learned, in the aftermath, the difference between being right and being effective, which is a different and harder skill. She helped an elderly tenant in one of the buildings understand a notice that had frightened him for a week, sitting with him and a cup of coffee and walking him through a ledger, line by line, until his shoulders came down from around his ears. And that afternoon, she came back to the motel and told the kids about it over dinner. And it was the first time in a long time she'd talked about her work like it was hers. And then the company, being a company, did the thing companies do. The communications department built a presentation for the board about the new fellowship's early success, and someone pulled a case study for it. And the case study used a photograph, a stock-feeling image, but unmistakable to anyone who'd been there, of furniture on a rainy sidewalk and children's beds. And it described a family whose crisis had launched the reforms. The names were removed. Everything else was recognizable. And at the same moment, Tessa applied, through the ordinary transparent process, for a stable long-term apartment in one of the company's renovated workforce buildings, and the automated screening system rejected her. It flagged the eviction. It flagged an unpaid balance, the false one, the one the migration had invented, still uncorrected in the database that fed the screening tool. It flagged a court filing that remained in the public record because the possession case, though paused, had been filed before Adrian ever stood in the rain, and filed things leave marks. The same company's own errors, fed into the same industry's own screening machine, had built a wall around Tessa Reed, and now that wall was keeping her out of stable housing at the very moment the company was telling its board that her story proved the walls were coming down. She found out about the presentation and the rejection in the same week. She went to Adrian's office, and she put 2 things on his glass table, a printout of the case study and her phone showing the screening rejection. She let him look at both. "You're telling the board this is fixed," she said, and her voice was very level, which he had learned to fear more than shouting. "You're using a picture of my kids' beds to prove it, and your own system just told me I'm not good enough to rent one of your apartments because of a debt your migration made up and an eviction your crew carried out." She pressed her palm flat on the table to steady it. "You keep trying to prove you're not your company, but your name is on every door. It's still closing." Adrian's first response was the old one, and it came out before he could stop it, and he was ashamed of it even as it left his mouth. "Let me fix the screening right now," he said, reaching for his phone. "I'll clear the balance. I'll approve the lease myself. I'll guarantee it. I'll have new beds delivered to the motel today." "No." Tessa's hand came down flat once, not loud, final. "That is exactly what you are not going to do. Again." She straightened. "You want to make a phone call and save me because you know my name. You saw my kids in the rain. What about the woman you didn't see? She's getting this same rejection today, from this same machine, and there's no billionaire standing on her sidewalk to make a phone call for her." She shook her head. "I don't want the owner to approve me. I want the door to open for the mother the owner will never meet. Until it does, take my kid's picture out of your presentation. You don't have my consent, and I'm done being your proof that things are better. When they're not better, they're just better for the one family you happen to watch." Marisol, who had been in the doorway, said quietly, "She's right, Adrian." And then, because she was honest, she added the thing she'd been carrying for 18 months. "And I was wrong. All those times I flagged it in a memo and let it get pushed to phase 2 and told myself I'd done my part. A memo isn't the same as refusing to let it happen. I kept my hands clean, and I kept my job, and the systems still didn't talk to each other. Somebody has to actually stop the machine, and it can't be a footnote anymore." Adrian put the phone down. It was, physically, one of the hardest things he had done in years. To not make the call, to not save the family in front of him, for the sake of the families he couldn't see, but he put it down. "Pull the case study," he said into the intercom, "immediately. Every copy, now, and get me the board and the vendor's account team, this week, not next quarter." What he did next cost him, which was how he finally knew it was real. He suspended automated eviction filings across the entire portfolio during any active appeal, which Daniel Knox, the executive over acquisitions and vendor contracts, warned him would slow delinquency reduction and spook 2 investors. Adrian let Daniel finish. Daniel's arguments were not stupid. They were the smooth, plausible arguments of a man who had never had to carry his brother's shoes in the rain, who genuinely believed that human review was too expensive and too slow, that at scale you had to accept a certain error rate the way a factory accepts a defect rate, that the alternative was fewer homes built for everyone. "Every hour of human review per case," Daniel said, "is a cost that comes out of new construction. You want to help more people? Build more units. Don't gum up the pipeline." "The pipeline put a child's bed on a sidewalk," Adrian said. "In my mother's name, I'm gumming up the pipeline." He required human review before any household's belongings could be removed. A trained employee had to check for pending assistance, recent payments, open maintenance disputes, active appeals, and the presence of children, and sign their name to it, so that a person, not a threshold, made the final decision. He forced the appeal system and the eviction vendor onto a shared platform, the Phase 2 integration that had been deferred for being unprofitable, and paid for it out of a budget Daniel wanted for expansion. He ordered a review of every eviction from the recently acquired properties, and where the migration had created false balances, there were many. The balances were corrected, and the families made whole, and where belongings had been damaged, legitimate compensation was paid, and it hit the quarter. And a board member said, not quietly, that Adrian was apologizing the company toward a loss. "We are not losing money," Adrian said. "We are returning money we were never owed and paying for damage we caused. If we've lost the ability to tell the difference between a loss and a refund, then we've become the thing I built this company to replace." He rewrote the vendor incentives so that successful payment plans and sustained housing stability were rewarded, and eviction speed was not. He required a genuine final resident contact attempt before any filing. He built a plain language ledger residents could actually read, and evening and weekend mediation hours for people who worked when the office was closed. He funded independent legal review and a real appeals process. He established a child impact review. The phrase made Daniel wince, and Adrian didn't care, so that before any physical removal involving a household with children, a human being had to look at what that meant. And he published the audit findings, the ugly ones, without spin and without a press release announcing that Adrian Vale had personally saved anyone, because Tessa had taught him that the announcement was the tell. None of it happened in one meeting. It took months, and there were errors in the rollout, and a shared platform that broke the first week and had to be patched, and staff who resented the extra steps, and staff who wept with relief at finally being allowed to slow down and help. Tessa was in the middle of it, reviewing draft procedures, pointing at the fourth click and saying, "Make it the first," pointing at the legal language and saying, "Nobody talks like this," pointing at the office hours and saying, "Who is this for, if not the people who work nights?" Marisol stopped writing memos and started refusing to sign off on removals she couldn't verify. Daniel lost some fights and won a few. The reforms had to be financially survivable, and some of his cautions were correct. And the thing they built together was not a fairy tale. It was a compromise that worked, which is the only kind of reform that lasts. Tessa completed her certification that winter. She finished the fellowship, her supervised hours, her final assessment, and she was hired, an actual job, a real salary, written terms, as the company's first resident account resolution specialist. She reviewed disputed balances. She caught migration errors before they became notices. She coordinated assistance payments so they landed on the right ledger. She built the plain language explanations residents got with every account, insisting they be understandable to a tired person at a kitchen table, because she had been that tired person at that table. She trained property managers to recognize the exact category of error that had nearly destroyed her family, and she reported systemic patterns to the Independent Oversight Board, and when a pattern turned out to be a hole, she made them fix the hole. She kept going to school at night, a few credits at a time toward a degree in property administration, and this time the childcare held, and the schedule held, and the money held, because those had been the things missing all along, never the ability. Her wrongful eviction record was corrected through a real legal and administrative process, slow, unglamorous. The possession case formally vacated on the merits once the false balance was disproven. The public filing annotated. The false debt struck from the ledger, and, in time, from the screening database. And with the record corrected, Tessa qualified for stable housing the ordinary way, through the transparent criteria that applied to anyone. A long-term lease in a renovated workforce building, at an affordable rent she paid herself, with enforceable tenant protections written into it. Not a gift from Adrian. A door that finally opened because someone had fixed the lock, and she had the key because she'd earned it. Adrian and Marisol did not become saints. Daniel did not become a villain who got fired in a triumphant scene. He stayed and argued, and was occasionally right, which is how real companies work. And Adrian's relationship with the memory of his mother changed, slowly. He'd carried the brass key for 30 years as proof that he'd kept his promise, that he'd built the stable home Rosa never had. He understood now that a key in his own pocket had never been the promise. The promise was a door that opened for the family he would never meet. He kept the key, but it stopped being a trophy and became a question he asked himself. What good is my key if her door is still locked? The Reed family moved into their new apartment on a clear, cold Saturday, and there was no ceremony, no cameras, no billionaire in the doorway. Just Tessa and Eli and June, and a rented van, and boxes they had carried for so long some of them had never been opened. Eli's planet sheets came out of the box, dry and whole, washed clean of the rain, and he spread them across his own bed in his own room. And he took the star stickers. Tessa had saved every one, peeled carefully off the old frame and pressed flat between two pieces of cardboard. And he arranged them on the ceiling this time, real constellations, in the shapes from his notebook. And the notebook itself he set on a shelf, out in the open, not hidden under a mattress, where things you can't afford to lose are kept. June put Pepper on the pillow of her own bed, in the pale green room Tessa had already painted to match the old one, and stood back and looked at the rabbit sitting there like it owned the place, and grinned. They unpacked all afternoon. Clothes went into drawers. Photographs went onto walls. And near the end of it, when the light was going, June looked around at the open boxes and the full drawers and the pictures on the wall, and she asked the question, the way she always asked it, straight up out of a child who trusts you to tell her the truth. Is this just for one night? Tessa set down the plate she was holding. She looked at her daughter, at her son on the floor with his star stickers, at the rooms that were theirs, and she felt the old lie rise up in her out of pure habit, and then die in her throat where it belonged. No, she said, not for one night. This time we unpack the whole thing. June considered this with great seriousness. Then she said, even the Christmas box? And Tessa laughed, really laughed, and said even the Christmas box, and Eli called from the floor that they didn't have a Christmas box, and June said they should get one, and that was the end of the conversation, which is how you know a thing is really over, when it stops being a moment and just becomes an ordinary Saturday. Months later, in the middle of a hard winter storm, a different family's account tipped into what the old system would have called delinquency. Wrong balance, a migration ghost, an assistance payment sitting on the wrong ledger, the same category of error, the same machine logic. But the machine was different now. The automated filing paused because there was an active dispute. A human reviewer got the case, and the reviewer was trained to look. And the reviewer saw the pending assistance and the recent payment and the 2 children in the household, and did not send a crew. Instead, the resident got a plain language ledger, a phone call from a real person, an evening mediation appointment, and a correction. No notice ever went up on the door. No bed ever reached the curb. The children slept in their own beds through the whole storm and never knew how close it had come, which is the entire point. That the best version of help is the kind the people helped never have to feel. Tessa was part of that, not by paying anyone's rent, by having built the plain language ledger, trained the reviewer, flagged the migration category months before, sat on the board that required the pause. She saw the case cross her desk, resolved, and she filed it. and she felt something she didn't have a clean word for, which was maybe just the feeling of a debt being paid forward to a stranger. Adrian got the report a week later. He read that a family's beds had stayed inside during a storm because a human being had read the whole story before anyone acted, and he did not go stand in anyone's doorway, and no one applauded him. And that was exactly right. The strongest proof that he'd finally built the correct answer to his mother's question was that no one had needed him to arrive in the rain. He took the brass key out of his pocket that evening and held it for a while, and then he did something he'd never done. He put it in a drawer, not to forget it, to stop carrying it like a wound. A key means very little, he had learned, if you're the only one who has a door. This story is fiction. Tessa and her children, Adrian and Rosa, the company and the building on Linden Court, none of them are real. But the rain is real. Right now, tonight, there are families standing on sidewalks watching their belongings come out a door. And some of those evictions are based on balances that are simply wrong. A misapplied payment, an assistance check that landed in the wrong account, a fee that stacked up automatically while a real person tried and tried to get someone to look. There are appeals that don't talk to the systems that carry out the removals. There are hardship programs that exist on paper and are never offered. And there are parents, more than you'll ever know, telling a frightened child that this is just for one night, while having no idea where they'll sleep the night after. Please understand, this is a story, not legal advice. If you or someone you love is facing eviction, don't face it alone the way Tessa almost did. Reach out to a local housing attorney, a tenant rights organization, or a legal aid service in your area. And keep every receipt, every email, every confirmation number, because in housing, the paper matters. And know that most of the people you'll meet in that system, the crew, the clerk, the person on the phone, are not the enemy. They're usually people working inside a machine they didn't design and can't fix by themselves. Real change rarely comes from one powerful person happening to witness one family's worst day. It comes from systems that read the whole story before they act. For the family, nobody important is watching. A favor can save one family from one storm. A fair process can keep thousands of beds from ever reaching the curb. So this week, listen for it. The gentle, terrible thing a parent says when they're trying to turn the ground falling out from under them into a small adventure. We're just staying somewhere else. It's only temporary. Just for one night. And if you ever hear it, from someone you love or someone you barely know, maybe just don't let it pass by unnoticed. If this story reached you, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need it, and tell me in the comments about a time your family had to make a hard thing sound small to get through it. Let me know where you're watching from, too. And if you'd like more stories like this one, take a moment to like and subscribe, because no child should have to watch their bed go out into the rain. And no parent should have to promise just for one night, without knowing if it's true. Thank you for being here. Take care of each other. And if you can, help somebody unpack.